Hi, I'm Marie, and my presentation will be on English as a new lingua franca in the age of globalization. The true language of commerce is the natural conversation between human beings. William Brown. So William Brown's pointing out that business is commerce and fundamentally communications between people. When a person is selling a commodity to another person and they're negotiating on the price of the commodity, a common language is required. Trade led to languages of commerce and convenience. As the world has changed and become more globalized, trade, transportation, communication, and languages used have changed and adapted. As the international conversation has changed, so have the words used to express ideas. I'll talk about lingua francas as they've changed over history. I'll talk about English in a globalized world. Then I'll describe the latest international language, which is English, and how it's different than those previous. And I'll define some key terms such as lingua franca, globalization, and language. I'll also talk about the impact and the effect of English on the people that use it and vice versa. I'll talk about the consequence of English as the world language, as the diversity of languages, cultures, and ideas in the world. We'll see that English has been very helpful for bringing the world together, but there is a price to be paid in loss of diversity. English is the foremost lingua franca in the world today. It began to replace French as the world's most prominent international language around the time of World War I and is at the end of a very long chain. History began at Sumer, and one of the main stories in civilization flows from Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean, then to Europe and the rest of the world. The Sumerian civilization was replaced by the larger Babylonian civilization, and the larger still Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire was followed by the Persian Empire, and then Alexander the Great's conquests. Finally, Rome conquered Greece. As these events happened, Sumerian was replaced by Akkadian, then Aramaic, then Greek, then Latin. As France came into prominence in Europe, French ultimately replaced Latin. Alongside this central story, other parts of the world had their own stories. Lingua franca creation and change is a process driven by conquest, colonialism, convenience, and commerce. In a new modern globalized world, science, technology, and a smaller world ultimately mean that English is more pervasive and widespread than any lingua franca has been before. It's spoken in more places by more people than any lingua franca has ever been. English has become a tool of what might be called cultural imperialism. Smallman and Brown also describe cultural globalization in chapter 5 of our text. Lingua franca is a bridge language used for communication between people who don't share a native language. The term actually comes from a pidgin language called lingua franca, used in the Mediterranean by sailors and traders between around 1000 AD and the 19th century. Pidgin is a simplified means of communication between people who don't share a tongue. A pidgin is not a complete language. A lingua franca can be either a pidgin or a complete language. English is a relatively new lingua franca. Again, this began around the time of World War I. English is also called a world language, a lingua franca that is used globally. Alongside English are relatively local lingua francas. For example, Spanish in the New World, Arabic in the Middle East, and Swahili in Africa. Each of these local lingua francas have their own stories. When Spanish replaced the Indian languages in the New World as a lingua franca, it replaced Aztec Nahuatl as the lingua franca in Mexico. Before Spanish became a lingua franca in the New World, Aztecs used Nahuatl as a lingua franca in Mexico. Globalization has changed the world in many ways, including the rise of English as a dominant and pervasive language. The increase in wealth and education, better communication, and transportation, and other changes have resulted in a smaller, globalized world. Many new ideas and inventions have contributed to this. The rise of science and logic, improved transportation such as ships and railroads, and improved communication technology such as the telegraph and telephone, computers and the internet, satellites, and cell phones. This smaller, more integrated globalized world means that English is used by more people in more places than any lingua franca has been before. People around the world experience pressure to learn English to earn money, get a job, or connect or join with the world, as in leave poverty. English is widely used in international communication, for example, by the press, on the internet, and in social media. English is also used in international aviation and navigation communications. English language, movies, and music tend to dominate entertainment in many countries and internationally. The working language used at the UN, the World Court, and in diplomatic communications is generally English. A feature of English that makes it different compared with all other languages is its global spread. David Crystal. So again, English is different because it is a lingua franca used around the world, and because with the internet, its use is so pervasive. It is different from any other language or lingua franca used before. So here I'd like to pause and talk about what a language actually is. The language we use is more than a collection of words. It represents patterns in thought, and language is used to develop systems of thought. Language includes body language, tone, volume, your words, your grammar, and the ideas behind these things. Language also could be said to include shared ideas, cultural or otherwise, such as the meme concept in social media today. Language is written and spoken, prose and verse, formal and informal, complete or partial, like a pigeon. At higher levels, language shades into philosophy and religion. When a lingua franca is adopted or imposed, it affects all of these things. English is so pervasive that there is a possible threat to other languages around the world. Thus, linguistic diversity is threatened alongside with diversity of culture and thought. In a similar but relatively local way, Spanish, Portuguese, English, and French have negatively impacted the diversity of language, culture, and thought in the New World. When a lingua franca is imposed, the result is often a process best labeled as cultural imperialism. Often not only the language, but the cultural thought and patterns and ideas are imposed as well. Cultural globalization is described by Smallman and Brown on page 98 of the text. We see here the Behistun inscription in Western Iran, commissioned by Darius the Great around 500 BC to celebrate the creation of the Persian Empire. It is written in 3 languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian. All 3 languages are written with the same script, which is cuneiform. Old Persian was used as the languages of the conquerors, but it wasn't widely understood. Elamite was a prestige language, and again, it was also not widely understood. Akkadian was the lingua franca of the idea and was widely understood in the empire. The cuneiform script was widely used because it was relatively easy to learn and write. It replaced several earlier scripts which were more complicated. English is an example of a bridge language, and cuneiform is an example of a script common to many languages. So to conclude, English is a lingua franca like there has never been before. There have been many lingua francas in the past, and there are many in the world today, but there really is only one lingua franca we can call a world language, and that's English. Because of modernization and globalization, and specifically things like the recent development of the internet, English is more pervasive and global than lingua franca has ever been. Because language is so connected to culture and thought, English as a global lingua franca may be threatening the diversity of language and culture in the world today. Thank you for coming to my presentations, my bibliography.